A port city can disappear without an army ever arriving. The climate can do that. It can be the thing that ruins it. This is about 20 times that happened. 20 climate events that wiped out ancient trading centers. They just vanished, and by the end, you'll see the forces that did it, the invisible things that redraw the map of commerce. That topple trade empires. A drought can silence a desert city. A harbor can end up at the bottom of the sea. These stories show a pattern: prosperity, then adaptation, then collapse. And there are lessons in that, urgent ones for us now. So what's the biggest lesson a lost civilization has for us? The climate was the first business partner. Every port that grew, every desert market, every city along a caravan route, they all had that partner. It wasn't a small thing, it was the whole foundation. These ancient merchants, the people who built these places, they were watching the world. They built their trading empires where the environment said yes. And it had to say yes consistently. A harbor needed predictable winds. Those winds filled the sails, brought the ships in. A farming settlement, one that supplied a trade post, it needed regular rain. A river, if you were going to use it as a road, it needed a steady flow, manageable. When the climate kept those promises, civilization flourished. Trade networks could stretch for thousands of miles. Ideas moved with the spices, with the silks. Wealth built things, temples, palaces. That stability, archaeologists see it now. They see it in the layers. The layers of prosperity, but to see the collapse, you have to see the partnership first. Scientists now, they're like detectives for that relationship. They're not just looking at broken pottery or piles of coins. They look deeper. They drill into the ice in Greenland. They pull up long cores of ice, and those cores hold tiny bubbles. Bubbles of ancient atmosphere. It's a frozen record, a record of the planet's temperature. They look at sediment at the bottom of lakes. Those layers preserve pollen. Pollen from forests that are gone now. They study tree rings, ancient trees. Each ring is like a diary entry. It notes a year, a good year of rain or a year of punishing drought. You take that climate data, you combine it with the archaeology, and a picture emerges. It becomes startlingly clear. You can see the decades of perfect conditions that let a city rise. And then, often with a kind of chilling precision, you can see those conditions change. The reliable partner, it becomes unpredictable, then it becomes hostile. That's the link, the inseparable link. The prosperity was always borrowed. It was borrowed from the environment, and as we'll see, with these 20 fallen hubs, when that environment called in the debt, the bill it presented, it could erase a city from the map. The first bill came due in Mesopotamia, that land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Akkadian Empire was there, and they did something new. They built the first real international trade network. From their capital, Akkad, they coordinated a flow of goods across the known world. Timber from the cedar forests of Lebanon, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli, that deep blue gemstone, traveled 2,000 miles. From the mountains of what's now Afghanistan, Akkad was the central switchboard, a hub connecting distant cultures, generating immense wealth. Their prosperity came from that fertile crescent. Lush land, predictable river floods, reliable rains. But then the partner changed the terms. Around 2,200 years before the Common Era, the rains stopped. A drought set in, not for a season, for generations. Scientists call it the 4.2 kiloyear event, a climatic shift so profound, its signature is in ice cores from Greenland. In sediment layers in the Persian Gulf, likely triggered by a perfect storm, shifts in ocean currents, massive volcanic eruptions filling the sky with sun-blocking ash. The fertile plains baked, the rivers shrank, the agricultural surplus vanished, the surplus that fed the cities, that financed the trade caravans. You can almost hear the silence. Those bustling trade arteries, once filled with donkeys and merchants carrying stones and metals, they fell quiet, Without food, the social contract frayed. Populations faced immense hardship. Historical records from the time speak of people selling their children for scraps. Communities connected by trade turned inward, or turned on each other, competing for the last pockets of water and grain. The central authority in Akkad lost its grip. The empire didn't fall to a more powerful army. It fragmented from within, starved by a climate that no longer supported its foundational bargain. The world's first great trade network wasn't defeated by swords. It was defeated by dust, and it left a lesson in the dry soil. A civilization, no matter how sophisticated its trade or powerful its king, is only ever one prolonged drought away from becoming a memory. The dust of Akkad settled, but those same forces, the climate, they were already at work somewhere else, far to the east, in what's now Gujarat in India. The Indus Valley civilization had built something there, a city called Lothal, and Lothal was built by engineers. It was a planned port, the world's earliest known dock. A perfect rectangle lined with brick, filled with water, connected by a channel out to the sea. That was precision, that was foresight. Ships would come here from distant Mesopotamia. They came to load cargo, carnelian beads, they gleamed like fire, ivory, fine cotton cloth. Lothal was a gateway, a busy point in a trade network that crossed oceans. Its wealth came from a simple, reliable fact. The sea was right there, accessible, and the river, the Sabarmati, it brought fresh water. It connected the inland areas to the port. The monsoon rains came and replenished it all, but that partnership changed. The ground began to shift. Tectonic forces, slow and huge, caused the land to lift gently, and at the same time, the monsoon patterns, that life-giving pulse for the region, they became unreliable. The combination was devastating. The Sabarmati River, maybe starved of a consistent flow, it changed course. And when the rains did come, they came hard. Without the river's old path to guide it, water flooded the city, not just once. This happened repeatedly. That brilliant dock, that ancient marvel, it started to fill with silt, layer by layer. The mud choked it. You can see the slow struggle, the dredging, the repairs, the constant fight against the accumulating earth. Every flood left more sediment. Every season, the channel to the open sea got shallower, narrower. The big trading ships, the deep-drafted ones, they couldn't reach the port anymore. The city's entire reason for being, its economic heartbeat, was slowly strangled. There was no sudden disaster, no invasion, just a gradual, inexorable silting. The trade dried up, the wealth faded, and the people, over generations, they made a quiet decision. They left, they moved to where the water still flowed. Where the land was still generous, Lothal was abandoned, left to the very earth it was built on. The docks filled in completely, the buildings crumbled. And that silt, the same silt that killed it, became its shroud. It preserved the city's layout for archaeologists to find millennia later, a ghost town. Buried not by sand but by a river's betrayed promise. A vibrant gateway to the world, silenced because the climate and the land conspired to close the door. The desert keeps its secrets, and for a long time one of those secrets was a city, Ubar. Some called it the City of Pillars. Later, people would talk about it as the Atlantis of the sands. A place of incredible wealth lost in the empty quarter of Arabia, the Rub al-Khali, a place of dunes where nothing should live, but Ubar did live. Its wealth came from a smell. Frankincense, that resin was worth its weight in gold back then. It was burned in temples everywhere, in Rome, in Babylon, used for burials, for medicine, for ceremonies. And all of it came from these specific trees, Boswellia trees. They only grew in one harsh part of southern Arabia. Ubar was at the center of that trade. An oasis in nothingness. Caravans with thousands of camels would cross the dunes for weeks to get there. It was a hub, a resupply point, a fortress for commerce in a place that killed travelers. So how does a city like that vanish, not just fade, but disappear so totally it becomes a legend? It comes down to a partnership that broke. Ubar existed because of hidden water. Not a river, an aquifer, a huge underground lake trapped in the rock under the sand. They built the city right on top of it. They dug deep wells down to the water. That water fed the date palms, it watered all the camels, it made a permanent green spot in a brown world, and for centuries it worked, the climate provided. Just enough rain, sometimes far away in the mountains, to slowly refill that underground lake. But then the refilling stopped, a long drought set in. For generations, no rain fell in the right places. The water was used, but it wasn't being replaced. The water table dropped. The wells had to go deeper. And deeper until they hit dry rock. The oases started to die, the palms died, the camels had nothing. But the final act was more dramatic. That aquifer wasn't just water. It was a support. The caverns that held the water also held up the ground. When the water was drained for good, those spaces collapsed. The ground the city stood on became unstable. And then a large part of Ubar just sank. It fell into a massive sinkhole, swallowed by the earth. Later, satellite pictures showed the old caravan tracks, all leading to one big depression in the desert. They dug there and found it. The ruins of a fortress city at the bottom of that collapse. Ubar didn't fade. It was consumed. The desert didn't bury it with sand. It pulled the foundation out from under it. Losing that hub was a disaster for the frankincense trade. The safe harbor was gone. The routes became too dangerous. Trade shifted, found new paths, and the city of pillars became a story, a warning about the desert's real power. It showed that even the smartest human trick, tapping hidden water, is just a temporary deal. When the climate stops, when the rain doesn't come, the desert doesn't just take back the surface. It can take back the space under your feet. The frescoes in Akrotiri were still wet. The paint hadn't dried. This was on Thera, a port city, a Minoan city, the northern point of that civilization. A trade hub. They had 3-story buildings, plumbing in the walls, and the art frescoes of fishermen, of antelopes, a society in motion. They traded pottery, copper, saffron. Their prosperity was right there on the walls, and then the painters put down their brushes. They left. The city was empty. They knew something was coming. They felt the earthquakes, saw the ground swell. They had time. They took their valuables and they left. What they couldn't take was the city. Their partner in prosperity this time wasn't the climate. It was the earth, the ground beneath them, and that partner was about to break the deal. Around 1600 BC, the Thera volcano erupted. It was a cataclysm. One of the largest in human history. The mountain tore itself apart. The center of the island collapsed into the magma chamber that created the caldera, the bay you see at Santorini now. In that instant, Akrotiri was entombed, buried under meters of hot ash and pumice, a perfect snapshot of Bronze Age life, frozen. But the disaster didn't stop at the shore. The collapse into the sea triggered something else, a tsunami, a wave of unimaginable scale radiating out across the eastern Mediterranean. It reached Crete, the heart of the Minoan world, over 100 kilometers away. Coastal towns, harbors, the fleet smashed. The waves scoured the coastline. It wiped out infrastructure, lives in an instant. The trade routes, those sea lanes that carried goods and ideas, were severed. Not by politics, by a wall of water. The Minoan decline that followed wasn't only because of Thera, but the eruption was a knockout blow, a 1-2 punch. First, the ash fall, blotting out the sun, damaging agriculture. Then the tsunami, destroying the ports and the ships, the empire's lifeline. Those vibrant frescoes, showing a society confident in its connection to the sea, became a relic. Their trade hub wasn't just buried. Its destruction sent shockwaves that crippled an entire civilization's ability to trade. The volcano didn't just erase a city. It reshaped the map of power in the ancient Mediterranean. The ground we build on can be the most treacherous partner. The rock held the water. That was Petra's genius. In a desert, water is everything. The Nabateans didn't just find it, they mastered it. They carved their capital right into the cliffs, their tombs, their treasury. But their real masterpiece was invisible, a hidden network, channels and cisterns and dams. They captured every drop of winter rain, every flash flood that roared through the sick, that narrow canyon. They stored it, they distributed it. That engineering turned a desert gorge into a fortress, a lush, defensible place, and it sat at a perfect crossroads. The incense routes from southern Arabia, the silk roads from the east, they all converged here. Caravans of thousands of camels would come out of the sick into the light. Unloading spices, silks, frankincense, Petra was a toll booth, a warehouse, a palace. Its wealth was carved in stone, but it flowed from water. Then the ground shook. Not once, but repeatedly, major earthquakes in the 4th century and again in the 6th. These weren't just tremors, they targeted the city's life support. Those water channels snaking along the canyon walls were shattered. The dams and cisterns were cracked. The balance was broken. Flash floods, no longer controlled, would have scoured the sick, burying parts of it in debris. Repairing that system, a complex, gravity-fed network, in an era of declining resources would have been a monumental task. The city's greatest strength became its critical vulnerability, and at the same time trade was changing. Roman merchants had mastered the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean. It became safer, faster, cheaper to ship incense and spices by sea, directly to ports like Alexandria. The overland caravan routes, with their tolls and bandits and deserts, began to look less appealing. Petra's geographical advantage was being bypassed by technology and nautical knowledge. There's also evidence from tree rings, sediment cores, of a drier period settling over the region. Less rain meant less water to capture. Even if the system was fixed, the combination was relentless: a broken water system, a shifting economic landscape, a possibly drier climate. Petra didn't fall to an army. It was made irrelevant. The economic heart of the city, that rhythm of caravan bells and merchants, began to slow. People left for places where water was easier and trade still flowed. The tombs became monuments, then curiosities. The Nabateans' adaptation to their environment was undone by a force they couldn't engineer against: the movement of the earth itself and the changing currents of global commerce. The silence that fell over Petra was the silence of a brilliant machine, its vital part broken, left to be reclaimed by the very stone it came from. A city built by controlling water was finally defeated by its loss. The silence in a jungle is different. It's a slow, green kind of swallowing, and that silence came for Angkor, the greatest city on earth. When you stand at Angkor Wat now, you see a temple. But Angkor itself was a machine, built for water. The Khmer Empire was engineered here, an inland port connected by canals all the way to the Gulf of Thailand. Goods came in: porcelain, spices, metals, and what went out was rice. That was the empire's wealth, grown in massive paddies. That rice fed maybe 1 million people. It paid for the armies and the artists, and all of it depended on a hydraulic system, a breathtakingly complex one: giant reservoirs called barrays, canals and moats, all designed to catch the monsoon, to store that water and release it for farming year-round. It was a triumph, a partnership with the rhythm of the rains. But then the rhythm broke. Tree rings from that region tell the story. Starting in the late 13th century, the monsoon turned volatile. Decades of intense floods followed by periods of severe drought. This wasn't gradual, it was a violent swing. The system was built for balance, not for extremes. The massive floods would have overwhelmed the canals, breached the dikes, washed the topsoil away. Then the droughts would hit. The giant reservoirs, maybe already silted up, would sit nearly empty, the rice paddies cracked in the sun. Famine followed. The very engineering that made Angkor possible became its weakness. A system that needed constant maintenance was facing repeated failures. The stress built from all sides. Siltation from the floods clogged the canals. Clearing them required a huge labor needed for farming or for defense. Political tensions with neighboring states strained resources, and there's evidence the elite began investing elsewhere, in newer coastal trade centers. Where maritime commerce was taking over, the economic heart was moving to the coast, leaving the inland giant behind. The abandonment wasn't a single event. It was a slow retreat. The central administration likely shifted south, closer to the sea and the new trade routes. The magnificent temples weren't destroyed. They were just left, the priests, the caretakers, the farmers. They gradually moved away from a machine that no longer worked. The jungle didn't conquer Angkor with force. It waited for the water to stop, and then it moved in. Roots pried apart the stone, vines draped over the divine faces. The greatest hydraulic city the world had ever seen was defeated by water itself. Not by a lack of it, but by its terrible, unpredictable inconsistency. The Tiber was the water that fed Rome, and it could drown it too. Ostia sat at the river's mouth. The empire's front door. Every year, the big grain ships would come in from Egypt, from North Africa, their holds packed with wheat. That wheat fed 1 million citizens in Rome. Kept them from hunger, and with the grain came other things: marble for building, olive oil in those giant clay jars, spices, silks, animals for the games. Ostia never stopped, a constant roar, warehouses for miles, cranes groaning, dockworkers day and night. All the wealth of the Mediterranean flowed through this one point. It was a machine, built to funnel everything into the heart of the empire, but the machine had a flaw. It was at the end of a river, and a river carries more than water. It carries earth. For centuries, the Tiber had been washing soil down from the hills, depositing that silt right at its mouth, right where the harbor was. The Romans were brilliant engineers. They dredged constantly, built breakwaters. For a long time they held the line, but they were fighting a natural process. One they couldn't stop. Then the climate shifted. In the late Roman period, a few things happened. A modest sea level rise, maybe from the end of a cooler climate phase. And more storms in the Mediterranean, more intense storm surges. These weren't sudden, catastrophic storms. It was a creeping menace. Each powerful storm would push seawater inland, flooding Ostia's low areas. Each surge would carry more sediment into the harbor. The silt would settle as the water went back out. The dredging became a losing game. The harbor grew shallower. Once deep enough for the biggest ships, now, year by year, inch by inch, you can see the slow crisis. A grain ship from Alexandria, drawing too much water, can't enter the main harbor. It has to anchor offshore, transfer its cargo to smaller boats. That means delay, extra cost, risk. The efficiency that made Ostia vital started to leak away. The economic foundation was being eroded, literally, by silt and salt water. Rome needed its grain, so trade just moved. It went to other ports that could handle the big ships. To Portus, a newer harbor complex built right next to Ostia by Claudius. Even Portus would struggle with silt later, but the shift had happened. The lifeblood of commerce found a new vein. Ostia wasn't burned, it wasn't sacked, it was made obsolete. The docks went quiet, the warehouses emptied, and without its reason for being, the city slowly emptied too. The apartments, the baths, the theaters abandoned. The silt and mud fought for so long finally won. They crept over the streets, filled the ground floors of buildings, sealed the city under earth. Ostia's story is one of gradual suffocation. No single disaster, just the quiet, relentless work of environmental change. A lesson that even the mightiest empire, with all its engineering, is vulnerable to the slow consequences. A shifting partnership with the sea. The gateway to Rome wasn't broken. It was gently filled in. The harbor silted up, the desert sank, the jungle grew back, but the cold is a different kind of eraser. It works slowly, and it works in complete silence. On the western edge of the known world, the Norse built 2 settlements on Greenland. They arrived during what's called the medieval warm period. For a few centuries, the North Atlantic was unusually mild. The southern fjords of Greenland were green enough to pasture sheep and cattle. The seas were open, and the Norse found something there worth a fortune back in Europe. Ivory, not from elephants, from walruses. Their tusks and the spiraled tusks of narwhals were prized for carvings, for ceremonial objects. Hides from seals and walrus were valuable too. This was the colony's economic lifeblood. They weren't just farmers clinging to the edge of the world. They were traders, a remote outpost in a specialized luxury market. Ships would come from Iceland and Norway, bringing iron, timber, grain. They would leave laden with ivory. It was a precarious link, but a profitable one. And it depended entirely on 2 climate promises: open water for sailing, and enough summer warmth to grow grass for hay. Then the promises broke. The Little Ice Age began its descent in the 14th century. This wasn't just a few cold winters. It was a profound climatic shift that lasted centuries. Temperatures across the North Atlantic plummeted. The growing seasons in Greenland shortened dramatically. Pastureland that had supported livestock began to fail. Summers were too short and too cool to grow enough hay, and the winters were brutally long and now even colder. Starving livestock meant less food, less wool, less of everything for the settlers, but the second blow was more direct. The sea ice expanded. Thick, impenetrable pack ice began to choke the sailing routes. The journey from Iceland, once a calculated risk, became a deadly gamble. Ships were crushed, or they simply couldn't get through. The trade lifeline was severed. No ships meant no imports of essential goods, no iron for tools, no timber for repairs, and it meant no way to export their ivory. Their entire reason for being in that harsh place evaporated. Isolation became a death sentence. Cut off from trade, the Norse settlements faced impossible choices. The archaeological evidence suggests they doubled down on what they knew. They kept trying to farm like Europeans, even as the land could no longer support it. They built their churches with stone, but their diet shows increasing malnutrition. They did not adopt the survival strategies of the Inuit, who thrived in the same cooling climate by hunting seals and whales from kayaks. The Norse identity was tied to being livestock farmers and Christians, not nomadic hunters. This cultural rigidity in the face of an environmental crisis left them vulnerable. The last written record of the Eastern settlement is a wedding from the early 14th century. After that, silence. When a ship finally managed to reach the fjords again in the 15th century, they found empty farms, no signs of war, no massacre. Just abandoned stone foundations slowly being buried by the advancing cold. The settlements didn't fall. They were slowly, quietly strangled by the cold. A trade outpost built on a climatic anomaly was reclaimed when that anomaly ended. The howler monkeys in the lowland jungles went quiet. They'd been hearing another sound for centuries. The sound of trade. At Tikal, the stone causeways were busy with porters. They carried bundles of bright green jade from the mountains. Obsidian blades came down from the volcanic highlands. They were traded for sacks of cacao beans, for the shimmering feathers of the quetzal bird. This city was a giant, its pyramids pushed up through the canopy. Its plazas were built to impress the merchants who came. Tikal's wealth came from controlling the map. It was the central point. All these luxury goods came through here before moving elsewhere. The rulers were like stone gods. Their power was absolute until the rains didn't come. Their partnership was with water, but it was a fragile one. The Maya lowlands don't have big rivers. There are no great lakes. All the water came from the sky. It was collected in reservoirs, in natural sinkholes called cenotes. The whole farming system, the drinking water for a huge population, it all relied on the summer rains. Predictable heavy rains. For centuries those rains came, the reservoirs filled up, the maize grew tall. Then, in the 8th and 9th centuries, that pattern broke. Sediment cores from nearby lakes tell the story. Layer after layer shows severe drought. Decades of it, the yearly rains failed again and again. The reservoirs, the city's lifelines, shrank down to mud. The maize fields withered under the constant sun. Famine is a quiet crisis. It speaks in different ways. You see it in children's bones with lines that show growth stopping. You hear it in the language of politics, which becomes desperate. As the water disappeared and food got scarce, the agreement that held Tikal together started to unravel. The king was a divine figure. He was supposed to ensure the rains, the harvests. People saw that he'd lost the gods' favor. His spiritual authority crumbled while the earth dried and cracked. Rival city-states were struggling with the same drought. They saw a chance. Warfare got worse. Not big, legendary battles, a brutal, grinding conflict over whatever was left. Over pockets of forest that still had game. Over the few water sources that still worked. The inscriptions on stone monuments used to boast about conquests, about royal marriages. Now they tell of captures, of defeats, of dark periods. A trade network collapses long before the last person goes. As the political chaos grew, moving goods safely became impossible. A porter carrying jade on a forest trail was now a target for bandits or for soldiers from a rival city. The central authority that kept the trade routes secure was gone. One by one, those economic pathways were cut. The flow of obsidian, of feathers, of cacao, these things defined elite Maya life, their rituals. That flow dried up. The wealth that built the towering temples just evaporated. What you find in the end isn't a city destroyed by war. It's a city emptied because its system broke. The grand plazas at Tikal weren't burned. They were just left. The royal palace went quiet. The last dated monument went up in 869. After that, the masons put down their tools. The priests left the temples. The farmers, with no water for their fields and no market to sell any extra food, they probably drifted back into the forest. To smaller settlements near the remaining cenotes, the jungle didn't have to conquer Tikal. It just waited for the people to finish leaving. Then it started its slow work reclaiming the stone. Tikal's story is about a deep, interconnected vulnerability. It shows that a society's sophistication isn't a shield. Their brilliant calendars, their knowledge of the stars, their intricate trade networks, none of it could make it rain. The drought was the trigger, but it pulled the trigger on a system that was already loaded with political and social tension. The climate event didn't just cause a food shortage. It shattered the whole idea of kingship. It started wars over resources. It cut the economic connections that made a great city possible. A powerhouse of the ancient world was finally defeated. Not by a stronger army, by the absence of clouds. Lulan, it was a story from the desert, a promise of water in the Taklamakan. That name means you go in, you don't come out. But Lulan was there, on the edge of a salt lake, Lop Nur. For the Silk Road caravans, it was everything. After weeks in the dunes, it meant survival. Water, date palms, a place to rest, to trade. It was a busy place. Chinese officials, Sogdian merchants, all kinds of people. Taxes funded a kingdom. You can see it in what they left: carved wood, silk, documents in different scripts, a place that connected worlds, but that promise was written in water. Lulan's life, the lake's life, it all came from one source, the Tarim River, coming down from the Tian Shan Mountains, snowmelt and glaciers. For centuries it was reliable. It filled the lake made a microclimate, it sustained the oasis. Then things changed. Around the 4th century, the river began to wander, tectonic shifts underground. They changed the slope of the land. The Tarim's course shifted away from the lake, and at the same time the climate got colder, drier, the glaciers retreated. Less meltwater to feed the river, so the lifeline was cut from two directions. The lake didn't vanish overnight. It shrank, the shoreline receded, the water turned brackish. Then too salty, the reed beds died. Without the lake, the winds got stronger, hotter. They picked up salt and sand. They blasted the city's edges. The oasis springs began to fail. Fed by groundwater that wasn't being replenished, the date palms withered, the gardens turned to dust. You can see the slow response. Archaeologists find deeper wells. Dug to reach a falling water table, they find abandoned houses on the edges, doorways sealed by sand drifts. The trade caravans would arrive. They found less and less. Less water, less food, more risk. One by one, they started to bypass Lulan. They went to other oases, more reliable ones. The map of the Silk Road itself shifted. The city's reason for being evaporated, faster than the lake. In the end, the people made the only choice. They gathered what they could, and they walked away. Leaving their homes to the wind, the desert moved in. Sand filled the streets, buried the wooden pillars, sealed the city in a dry tomb. For centuries, Lulan was just a ghost. In old scrolls and travelers' tales, a legend. Then it was rediscovered, early 20th century. A snapshot frozen in time, a wooden loom with thread still attached. A child's toy, a meal left uneaten, a quiet end for a place full of noise, bargaining, camel bells, many languages. It's a lesson in dependency, a thriving civilization. A critical node in a network. It existed only as long as a single river flowed past its gates. When the climate and the land turned that river away, the city didn't just decline. It was erased, leaving only whispers in the sand. Lulan was preserved by the desert sand, but water can hide a city completely. There's a different kind of secret in the Gulf of Combat, off India's west coast. On the seafloor, marine archaeologists working there, they've seen something on their sonar, not shipwrecks, something older, the outlines of large geometric structures. Foundations, channels, they've brought up artifacts from the silt, stone tools, pottery. Some researchers suggest there's carved wood, bone fragments. Initial analysis says these objects might be over 9,000 years old. That's a staggering date. It puts this potential settlement just after the last ice age. A time when humans were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, not building cities. The theory is it was a riverine trade culture, built along the banks of a vanished river. Maybe an extension of the Sabarmati, flowing into a different coastline, a hub for exchanging goods and ideas, long before Mesopotamia, long before the Indus Valley. But then the world warmed. The great ice sheets began to melt, at a pace that's difficult to comprehend. Vast quantities of water poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose, not inches over centuries, hundreds of feet over a relatively short period. This wasn't a gentle flooding, it was rapid, relentless. The continental shelves, dry land during the Ice Age, were drowned. Coastlines retreated dozens of miles inland, sometimes hundreds. For any settlement built on that low, fertile shelf, there was no escape. The water came in surges, driven by storms and meltwater pulses. It swallowed villages, fields, trading posts. The ground these people lived on vanished beneath the rising sea. An entire coastal network was erased from the map and from memory. This event didn't just destroy towns, it likely pushed survivors inland, forced them to adapt to new environments. Reset their social development. The clock on maritime trade there was turned back to zero. Those murky sonar images might be a lost chapter, a precursor to all that came later. A reminder, some of humanity's first experiments in settled life, in trade, they may not be under desert sand or jungle vine. They may be under 100 feet of seawater, waiting for us to understand what was lost when the ice melted and the shores changed forever. Beneath the Sahara, there was a civilization. They built an empire on ancient water. The Garamontes, they mastered an impossible landscape in what's now Libya. They weren't nomads, they were city dwellers, engineers, merchants. Their capital was Jerma. It was a hub on a network that crossed the sea of sand. Caravans brought salt from the desert's heart, a precious commodity. They brought goods from sub-Saharan Africa, ivory, gold, maybe exotic animals. This trade created wealth. It built fortified towns, a distinct culture in the middle of nowhere. Their survival, their success, it all hinged on one invention. The Fagara. These weren't simple wells, they were underground channels, sometimes stretching for miles, gently sloping tunnels dug deep into the bedrock. They tapped into fossil water, water that had fallen as rain tens of thousands of years earlier, sealed in vast aquifers under the desert, a non-renewable treasure. A legacy from a wetter age. The Fagaras brought this water to the surface by gravity. They created oasis gardens. Dates, grapes, grains could grow there. A triumph of ingenuity over a brutal environment. For centuries it worked. Jerma thrived, but the partnership had a fatal flaw from the beginning. They were living on savings, not income. Every drop they used was a drop not replaced. The climate, already arid, kept trending toward greater dryness. No new rain to recharge what was being taken. The depletion was invisible. It happened deep underground until the symptoms surfaced. The Fagaras began to run dry. The flow from the tunnels dwindled to a trickle. Then stopped. Maintaining these vast networks required constant labor to clear collapses and silt, labor that became harder to sustain as the water failed. The agricultural base shrank, the base that fed the cities, that supported the trade economy. The green pockets of the desert began to wither. A trade hub can't exist without a surplus. Without food and water to support the merchants, the porters, the guards, the entire economic machine grinds to a halt. The caravans would have arrived to find a weakening partner. Less food for the journey ahead, less stability. Over time, the lucrative routes likely shifted, seeking more reliable oases. The Garamantian cities didn't fall in a war. Not in a sudden disaster, they were slowly, meticulously emptied. People left in search of water. Their sophisticated urban life was no longer tenable. By the 7th century, Jerma and its sister cities were largely silent. Their ingenious Fagaras buried by drifting sand. Their story is a lesson in sustainability. They weren't primitive, they were highly advanced, yet their entire civilization was built on a resource they knew was finite. Their technology bought them time. Centuries of it, but it couldn't change the fundamental arithmetic, extraction in a drying world. They show us that even the most brilliant adaptation can become a trap. When the environment's ledger is finally read, a city's silence is told by what it left behind. In Choco Canyon, they left turquoise, thousands of beads, pendants, some from mines hundreds of miles away. They left scarlet macaw feathers brought up from the jungles of Mexico. They left pottery, designs that echoed across that high desert. This wasn't a simple farming village. It was a grand, planned landscape, a ceremonial center, an economic hub for the ancestral Puebloan world. Great houses rose 4 and 5 stories, hundreds of rooms aligned to solar and lunar cycles. A network of straight roads engineered, some 30 feet wide, radiating out for miles, connecting distant communities to this center, a place of pilgrimage. Exchange, profound ceremony. Its power was spiritual, but that spirituality was fed by a physical thing. Maize, corn, the lifeblood. The surplus from agriculture in and around the canyon supported the artisans, the astronomers, the priests, the traders who made Chaco a crossroads. And for over 300 years it worked. Then the sky withheld its gift. The story is in the trees. The ancient pinyon pines, the Douglas firs that still grow there hold a precise record in their rings. Scientists compiled that data into a drought timeline, and it reveals a catastrophe. The middle of the 12th century, a mega-drought took hold. It lasted 50 years. 5 decades where the summer rains failed, season after season after season. This wasn't a typical dry spell. It was an extreme climatic event, layered on top of a longer period of increasing aridity. The already marginal farmland of the canyon floor, the surrounding mesas, simply could not produce. The maize stalks withered. The carefully managed water catchment systems ran dry. The foundation of the entire society began to crumble. A ceremonial center cannot function without a surplus. When the food runs out, the complex social machine breaks down. The great houses designed for large gatherings and storage began to empty. The long-distance trade that brought in exotic goods, makors, turquoise, depended on a stable, wealthy core to organize it. To value it, as Chaco's ability to produce its own food vanished, so did its central role. The intricate web of relationships, the shared rituals, the economic exchanges that bound the region together began to fray. Communities likely turned inward, focusing on their own survival. The roads leading to Chaco, once bustling with travelers bearing offerings, fell into disuse. There was no invasion, no single dramatic event. The abandonment was a slow, painful retreat. People packed what they could and left their magnificent stone apartments. They migrated to areas with more reliable water, the cliffs and rivers of the Mesa Verde region, the Rio Grande Valley. They took their culture with them, their knowledge of building and ceremony, but the particular experiment that was Chaco, the grand, centralized hub, was over. The structures were not destroyed. They were simply left as if waiting for the people to return from a journey. The wind swept through the empty plazas. Sand drifted into the doorways, and the relentless sun baked the sandstone bricks, preserving a ghost of a civilization that had mastered everything except the rain. Chaco's end teaches a lesson about centralization, how a society built on a delicate environmental balance, organized around a single, powerful center, can be vulnerable when that balance shifts. The drought didn't just cause a food shortage. It dissolved the glue of a far-reaching trade and ceremonial network, leaving only whispers in the stone. And the enduring mystery of roads that lead to an empty city. A river can change history with its mud. The Yellow River in China, they called it China's sorrow. For thousands of years, its silt built the northern plains, but that silt was also a kind of trap. The riverbed kept rising from its own deposits. It flowed above the farmland held in by dikes. It was like a suspended highway of mud. Then, in 1194, during a time of wild climate, that balance broke. Torrential rains swelled the river. The dikes burst, and in one event, the Yellow River left its northern course. It cut a new path south, emptying into the Huai River basin. This wasn't a temporary flood. This new course held for over 700 years. The immediate damage was vast. Much of the North China Plain, some of the best farmland, was drowned under silt and water. Towns disappeared, but the shock went further. It hit the Song dynasty's economic spine, the Grand Canal. That canal was a logistical masterpiece. It connected the rice-rich Yangtze Delta in the south to the political capitals in the arid north. It moved the empire's lifeblood: grain, salt, silk, taxes. The Yellow River's new southern course intersected the Grand Canal like a wrecking ball. It poured sediment into the channels, clogging them. It changed water levels. Navigation became impossible. The vital artery was cut. The city at the center was Kaifeng. It had been a glorious capital, a hub of commerce, right where the Grand Canal met the Yellow River. Its wealth depended on controlling that junction. Now, the river that gave it life destroyed it. The flooding ruined its farmland. The silting of the canal crippled its purpose. The logistics that fed the city and the northern armies stopped. Famine and unrest followed. The dynasty, already under military pressure, found its economic foundation washed away. Kaifeng was briefly regained, but its time as a premier capital was over. The center had to shift. The response recalibrated China's economic geography. Later dynasties, learning from the disaster, made a decision. They moved the capital north to Beijing, safer from the river but far from the fertile south. To supply it, they undertook a huge engineering project. They rebuilt the Grand Canal, but this time they rerouted its most critical section east of the Yellow River Delta. They created a new, more stable corridor. That shift meant the primary trade routes, the flow of wealth and goods, now bypassed the old central plains. Cities along the new corridor, like Hangzhou and Yongzhou, grew in importance. Kaifeng, once the nexus of everything, was left inland, a relic. So this event shows a civilization adapting to a climate-driven disaster, not by defeating the river, but by rerouting its entire economy around it. The Yellow River's shift was a natural event made worse by land use and climate instability. It didn't just destroy farmland, it made a strategic network obsolete. The empire's answer was to build a new commercial reality. When the environment redraws the map, trade follows not the old centers of power, but the new pathways of practicality. Ephesus had a harbor. It was a door to the world. For centuries, it was the main Aegean gateway into Asia. Roman wealth flowed through it, later Byzantine wealth. Ships came from Alexandria, from Rome, from Syria. They brought spices, silks, papyrus. That commerce funded everything, the famous library, the grand theater holding 25,000. The Temple of Artemis, one of the ancient wonders. Ephesus was a connection point, a bridge between continents. Its whole identity was tied to the water. But that water's edge was moving. It was retreating slowly. The cause was the Casta River. We call it the Kusuk Mendirs now. For millennia, it flowed from the hills down to the sea at Ephesus. It brought fresh water, it brought fertile soil, and that soil was the problem. Deforestation happened inland, to clear land for farms, to get timber for the growing city. The hills lost their anchor. The roots that held the soil were gone. Then the climate shifted. The rains became more intense, more erosive. When that rain hit the bare slopes, it washed enormous amounts of earth into the river. The Casta turned into a thick, brown slurry of silt. It carried all that sediment right to the harbor mouth, into the engineered basin. Year after year, the silt settled. It piled up on the harbor floor. The water got shallower. The city fought back. The engineers dredged. They excavated. They tried to hold back the tide of earth. But they were fighting a consequence, a changed landscape upstream. It was a battle they couldn't win. You see the struggle in the architecture. They kept building new harbors further out, extending the waterfront as the old basins filled in. Each one was a temporary fix. The river kept bringing its mud. Slowly, the coastline advanced. The sea was pushed back. The deep water port became a swampy lagoon, then a malarial marsh, then dry land. By the late Byzantine era, the Aegean was miles from the city center. The great ships couldn't reach Ephesus anymore. The economic heartbeat stopped. The wealth moved to other ports, to places with accessible harbors. The theater looked out over fields of silt. Not masts and sails, the city didn't burn. It was stranded, left high and dry by the relentless work of a river doing what rivers do when the land that feeds them is stripped bare. This wasn't a classic natural disaster. It was a slow-motion event, accelerated by human choices far from the harbor. The deforestation, the farming, these were signs of a thriving society. But they altered the water balance, and that ultimately choked the very trade that fueled the growth. A premier gateway to Asia was closed, not by an enemy fleet, by the silent, steady accumulation of mud. A city that mastered commerce across oceans was defeated by the soil under its own feet. Furs went west, silver went east. Across a landscape of ice, Novgorod's wealth was built on the deep freeze of a Russian winter. This city was an eastern outpost for the Hanseatic League. A gateway, it funneled the riches of the northern forest, sable pelts, marten furs, beeswax, barrels of honey, to merchants in Lübeck and Bruges. In return came Flemish cloth, German silver, wine. This exchange was a carefully timed dance with the seasons. The whole system depended on a predictable rhythm, freeze and thaw. In winter, sledges needed frozen rivers and ground for swift transport. Come spring, the thaw opened the Volkhov River and Lake Ilmen to boats. The Hanseatic merchants ran on strict schedules. Their cog ships arrived and departed with the reliability of a calendar. For centuries, this partnership with the cold held. Then the rhythm changed. The Little Ice Age descended in the 14th century. For Novgorod, this wasn't just colder weather. It was a disruption of the environmental logic behind its trade. Winters grew longer, harsher. The freeze came earlier and lasted longer, which might sound good for sledges. But the intensity was the problem. The ice on the Volkhov grew too thick, too uneven. It could jam the river, making navigation impossible. Or sudden warm spells could cause dangerous thaws mid-winter, turning overland routes into bogs of mud and slush. The reliable schedule shattered. Hanseatic cogs risked being trapped in ice. Cargoes were delayed or lost. Merchant caravans faced more peril. The cost and risk of doing business there began to climb. At the same time, political shifts were happening. The Grand Duchy of Moscow was rising, challenging Novgorod's control over trade routes. The climatic stress made these political pressures worse. As the logistical challenges mounted, the Hanseatic League started to favor more reliable ports. Places like Reval, now Tallinn, with better ice-free harbors on the Baltic, they grew in importance. The trade arteries that had pumped wealth into Novgorod for generations began to constrict. The city didn't fall in a dramatic siege until later. Its commercial preeminence just chilled. The lifeblood of long-distance commerce found a less treacherous path. Novgorod's story shows something about environmental change. It's not always a single catastrophe. Sometimes it's the slow, cumulative erosion of an advantage. The city's entire economic identity was built on mastering a specific, predictable climate. When that pattern became volatile and extreme, the mastery turned to struggle. The ice, once a highway, became a barricade. A once hot market for furs and silver was slowly frozen out of the main currents of medieval trade, not by conquest, by a creeping, centuries-long winter that changed the rules. The dust wasn't just soil, it was the end of a crossroads. There was this civilization in Central Asia along the Oxus River. They built a world of trade, the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. Around 2000 BCE, their fortified centers like Gona de Pere were beacons. They sat at a critical junction. To the south, the Indus Valley; to the southwest, Mesopotamia; to the north, the steppes. Goods flowed through, tin and copper for bronze, lapis lazuli. Carved stone seals, these places were cultural melting pots. Ideas and technologies exchanged. Their wealth came from the river, the Oxus. Today it's the Amu Darya. It was their lifeline. They built irrigation canals, diverting water to create fields in the desert margin. That engineered abundance fed the cities. It financed the trade, but the climate record shows a partnership turning sour. Sediment cores point to intense aridity. The region grew drier, and with that dryness came the wind. Persistent dust storms, you can picture it, a haze, then a wall of fine particles. These storms did more than blot out the sun. They were a slow force. The dust settled everywhere. It choked the irrigation canals. That meant constant labor to clear them. It coated the leaves of crops, but perhaps the most damaging thing happened beneath the surface. In an arid climate, irrigation without drainage has a side effect. Salts, minerals in the river water are left behind as the water evaporates. Over time, they accumulate. They create a toxic crust. The land becomes poisoned, crops fail. The dust storms would have accelerated this, blowing salty particles onto fields. The agricultural surplus, the foundation of everything, began to wither. As the fields produced less, the whole system strained. Supporting artisans, merchants, administrators became harder. the trade relied on local stability. A secure base to provision caravans. When that base faltered, the network grew fragile. There was no single invasion that destroyed Ghana de pair. The environmental stress led to a gradual fragmentation. Communities likely dispersed, retreating to smaller oases, adopting a more nomadic life. The great centers were slowly abandoned. Their brickwork was left to the dust. The crossroads fell silent. It shows a subtle vulnerability. A civilization adapted to its river, mastering irrigation to create an oasis. It was ultimately undermined by the long-term consequences of that adaptation. In a changing climate, they built a hub connecting continents but couldn't stop the wind from carrying away the soil that fed it. Tyre made the color purple. That was the color of power, and they built their whole city on an island, this rocky island off the coast. It was a fortress in the sea with huge walls. They had two famous harbors, the Sidonian and the Egyptian, with breakwaters protecting them. Ships came from everywhere for the purple dye, from sea snails and for cedar wood. Tyre was a commercial titan. Its trade networks went all the way to Spain. Its wealth was legendary, and its downfall is often tied to Alexander the Great. His siege, where he built a causeway from the mainland to the island, but that causeway did something else. It permanently changed the coastal hydrology. It changed how the currents flowed, how sediment moved along that shore, and that set the stage for a slower enemy. Long after Alexander, in the late Roman period, the ground itself began to rebel. The eastern Mediterranean is seismically active. A series of powerful earthquakes hit the region. Records show major events in the 4th and 6th centuries. These were catastrophic shifts that leveled cities. For an island city like Tyre, built on rock with intricate harbor works, the damage was profound. The quakes would have shattered the breakwaters. They would have collapsed quays and warehouses into the water. They likely triggered local tsunamis, massive waves that scoured the harbors, flooding the low-lying parts. The combined effect was a death sentence for a port. The damaged breakwaters no longer held back the sea's energy or the sediment, and Alexander's causeway now funneled silt directly into the harbor basins. Without constant dredging, a task impossible for a city reeling from disaster, the harbors began to fill. The deep water ports grew shallow, choked with mud. A maritime trading power can't function without ports. Commerce slows to a trickle when ships can't dock, and as Tyre struggled to recover, the map of trade was already shifting. To the south, Alexandria was rising. With its magnificent man-made harbor, its connection to the Nile and the riches of Egypt, it offered safer, more modern facilities. Merchants seeking efficiency and security gradually redirected their voyages. Tyre's strategic advantage, its island fortress security, became a liability. It was now a damaged, silting relic, bypassed by new arteries of commerce. The purple dye trade faded. The city became a provincial town, its harbors slowly transforming into sandy coves. The storms of the earth and sea didn't conquer Tyre in a day. They undermined the very foundation of its existence, silver and iron. That's what the Hittites had. Their capital, Hattusa, sat up in the Anatolian highlands, a fortress city, a place for diplomacy, for law. They controlled the trade in those metals across the whole region, but their real weakness, it wasn't the mountains, it wasn't their treaties, it was food. Hattusa itself couldn't grow enough grain. Not for its people, not for its officials, not for its armies. So the empire's strength, it was this delicate web, a network, subject cities, allied kingdoms down in the more fertile lowlands. They'd send annual shipments of grain north, along guarded roads. This was the lifeline, a tribute of food that powered everything at the center. Then the rain stopped. Not for one season, for years. We know this from the tree rings, from sediment cores. Around 1200 BCE, right in the middle of the late Bronze Age, collapsed severe droughts. Multi-year droughts, they hit Anatolia, the eastern Mediterranean. The fertile lands that supplied the grain, their fields withered. The surplus just vanished. And famine set in, that slow, relentless work. You can see the collapse happen in steps. First, the frontier towns. These small outposts, they guarded the mountain passes, the roads that carried the grain. Without food from the center and with no way to feed themselves, the situation became impossible. People just left, they abandoned their posts, went looking for food. So the guardians of the trade routes, they disappeared. And with the frontiers open, the logistical chains were cut. Raiders, displaced groups, they could move freely now, disrupting whatever commerce was left. Inside the empire, the crisis got deeper. No grain shipments meant hunger in the capital. The whole social contract between the king and his people, between the capital and its subjects, it was built on provision. On security. A king who couldn't feed his people, he lost his divine mandate. He lost his authority. Internal unrest started simmering, then it boiled over. Tablets from that time, they show urgent pleas for food, desperate measures. The state, already strained from the logistical breakdown, now it faced internal fracture. The Hittite Empire didn't fall to one superior army. It was a cascade failure. The climate event, that prolonged drought, it struck the weakest link, the food supply. That shock broke the logistical network, which sparked the social unrest, which invited the external pressure. This major power, built on trade and treaties, it was hollowed out from within. By hunger, its central authority just dissolved. Hattusa, it wasn't sacked in some great battle. It was meticulously abandoned, its gates sealed, left empty to the wind and the rain. So the lesson is about interconnected fragility. A state can be mighty in war, rich in resources, but if its survival depends on a long supply line for something as basic as food, a supply line that's sensitive to the climate, then its fate is tied to the sky. That drought didn't just cause a famine, it unraveled the whole political and economic fabric of an empire. It showed how a climate shift can trigger the collapse of a trade-dependent civilization, leaving behind silent fortresses and unanswered letters just lying in the dust, done which was taken by the sea, but not all at once. It happened in whispers. This was on the Suffolk coast. It had been one of England's great ports, a member of the wool staple. Its harbour was full of ships. They carried wool to Flanders. They brought back cloth and wine. The town had churches, monasteries, a mint, a guild hall, all the signs of a wealthy medieval place. Its prosperity came from the North Sea. And then the North Sea decided to take it back. That change started in the 13th century. There was a climatic shift, a period of increased storminess in the North Atlantic. The weather grew more volatile, more violent, and this town was built on a soft coastline, clay and sand. For a place like that, this new weather was a death sentence. Written in the waves, the Great Storm of 1286, that was a catastrophe, a colossal surge. Ferocious winds drove it into the eastern coast. It overwhelmed the sea defenses, it scoured the shoreline. Contemporary accounts describe the horror. Hundreds of houses were washed away, shops, warehouses. Just gone, the harbor was devastated, the economic heart. The town reeled, but they tried to rebuild. This was their home, their livelihood. Then, 42 years later, 1328, another monumental storm hit. It finished what the first one had begun. More streets vanished, more churches crumbled into the sea. Their foundations were undermined by the churning water. The map of Dunwich was redrawn overnight. It was now much smaller, but the disaster wasn't just those two famous storms. It was the relentless aftermath. Every storm after that, every high tide, each one bit off another piece of the town. The coastal erosion became constant. A gnawing presence. Year after year, the cliffs retreated. Gardens became beaches. Roads just ended at new cliffs. The graveyard of one church would tumble into the waves. Then another, a sobering sight for the people still living there. The economic consequence was slow, but it was absolute. A port can't function without a harbor. As the shoreline retreated, the harbor was destroyed or silted up by shifting sediments. Ships could no longer dock safely. The wool trade moved, it went to other ports. Ports with safer anchorages, deeper water, the wealth left, the people faced economic ruin, and they faced the literal loss of the ground under them. They began a long retreat inland. They took apart some buildings to salvage the stone. They left others to their fate. By the end of the Middle Ages, most of Dunwich was gone. What remained was a small village, a ghost of that vibrant port. Today, it's a quiet place. On calm days, fishermen and divers sometimes report things. They see stone blocks on the seafloor, the outlines of streets, the remains of churches far out under the water. Archaeologists have used sonar. They've mapped a drowned town. Just offshore, a complete urban landscape preserved in the silty dark. Dunwich's end is a different kind of lesson. It wasn't a drought, it wasn't a change in trade winds. It was the direct physical consumption of land by a rising sea, a stormier sea, a thriving node in a medieval network. It wasn't conquered, it wasn't abandoned due to famine. It was quite simply eaten. It shows something. A commercial center's greatest asset is its access to the water, but that access can become its executioner. When the climate alters the rules, when it changes your engagement with the coast, the waves that once brought wealth, in the end, they brought only silence. 20 stories, different places, different times, but they all say the same thing. The same triggers keep showing up, a long drought like with Akkad or the Maya. The sea rising, taking the Gulf of Combat, taking Dunwich. Earthquakes breaking Petra's water system, burying Akrotiri. The monsoon failing, leaving Angkor, leaving Lothal. These were the things that changed everything, and the places that disappeared completely, they had something in common. They were built right on the edge of what could work. A desert oasis like Ubar, drinking from ancient water. A frozen settlement like the Norse in Greenland, holding on during a warm spell. A harbor like Ephesus, choked by silt from one river. Their genius was making a life in a hard place, but that meant there was no room for mistakes. Their deal with the environment was fragile, and when the climate changed even a little, it fell apart completely. But that pattern of collapse, it has another side, resilience. It's not just about endings, it's about redirection. Trade, that constant flow of people and goods, it almost never just stopped. It just found a new way. When the Yellow River moved and smothered Kaifeng, China didn't give up on north-south trade. They built a whole new canal system. New cities grew. When the overland Silk Road got too dangerous, merchants went by sea. That made different ports rich. The Hanseatic League, when Novgorod's winters got too harsh, they just used the more reliable Baltic ports instead. So that's the other half, collapse for the place that couldn't change, opportunity for the network that could. Putting this together shows you something basic. For these old civilizations, climate change wasn't some far-off threat. It wasn't one big disaster. It was a constant pressure, a factor in every long-term plan. So the fate of a trade hub came down to a few questions. How flexible was its economy? If the rains failed, could it do something other than farm? How well did it manage its key resource water, soil, timber? And maybe the biggest one, was the environmental shock something they could handle, or was it too much? A drought for a generation, you might live through that. A 50-year mega-drought like the one that emptied Choco Canyon, that can change everything for a culture. The quiet we find at these sites, it's not just nobody being there. It's the sound of a specific deal with nature breaking, and the noise we find in the cities that came next, that's the sound of a new deal being made. The pressure never left, the climate kept changing like it always does. The difference between a memory and a great city often came down to one simple ability. To hear the world changing and to have the courage to go somewhere else. That silence in the ruins, it's asking us something, those 20 hubs gone. From Akkad to Dunwich under the water, they're all saying the same thing. Prosperity is a temporary agreement. It's a deal you make with the land, the sea, the sky. And that deal can be broken anytime. The merchants in Ubar, they thought they'd mastered the desert. Angkor's engineers, they believed they'd tamed the monsoon. The Norse in Greenland, they trusted the ice. They trusted it to stay back. They were brilliant and they were wrong. Their stories aren't about primitive failure. They're about sophisticated civilizations, civilizations that met a force they couldn't outsmart, couldn't outbuild. The environment was their first business partner. And when that partner changed the terms, the contract was over. Our world today is built on the same kind of deal. Our trade network, it's a miracle of complexity. Container ships like skyscrapers moving across oceans, air freight delivering medicine overnight, digital markets moving capital at light speed. It feels invincible. But its foundation is physical, it's vulnerable, just like a harbor in Ephesus, just like an oasis fed by a river like Lulan, our megaports, Shanghai, Rotterdam. They're as susceptible to rising seas as Dunwich was. Our agricultural breadbaskets, they feed nations, they fuel trade, they depend on predictable rain the same way the fields around Hattusa did. Our supply chains are these long, intricate threads, a drought in one continent, a flood in another. It can snap those threads, and that causes not just local hardship. It causes global shock. The collapse isn't isolated anymore. In a connected world, it echoes everywhere. So the lesson in these lost stones, it's not a message of doom. It's a call for clear-eyed resilience. The civilizations that lasted, the people who endured, they were often the ones who could adapt, who could move, or change their practices or diversify. Our task is to build that adaptability in from the start, design ports for higher seas, create agricultural systems that can weather volatility, build redundancy into our critical networks, so if one hub falters, the flow finds another path. It means listening to the planet's signals, the shifting weather, the rising temperatures. Not as distant news, as urgent bulletins about our foundational partner. These silent places are more than archaeology. They're mirrors. They show us the potential end of a story we're still writing. Let the empty causeways of Choco remind us, the silted basins of Ostia. Our greatest achievements are temporary gifts from a living planet. The ultimate question for our age isn't whether we can prevent all change. The climate will change, it always has. The question is whether we have the wisdom to read the signs and the courage to change with it, to make sure the bustling hubs of our world don't become quiet, curious ruins one day. For future generations to puzzle over and to learn from all over again. The ruins are a warning, but they're also an invitation to look at our own world differently. Think about the great ports now: Rotterdam, Shanghai, Miami, Singapore. They're the modern Ostia, the modern Ephesus, the vital nodes in our network. And they sit in the same vulnerable places, on coastlines facing rising seas, in deltas threatened by stronger storms, or you can think about the agricultural regions. The ones that feed nations, the Central Valley in California, the wheat belts, they rely on a delicate balance, water and temperature, just like the fields that fed Akkad or the Hittite Empire. The past is asking our present a direct question. Are we listening? Are we building with resilience or repeating the old patterns, depending on a climate that history shows is never truly stable?